Monday blessings, everyone. This is Sharon Benton at First Congregational, and I have our scripture passage for this coming week, what we are working towards for Sunday. Now, we have heard the story just yesterday about Joseph, Jacob's second to youngest son, being sold into slavery in Egypt, and how when he was freed from slavery and became Pharaoh's right-hand person, Joseph brought his family into Egypt, his whole extended family, because there was a famine where the family was living. And Joseph had prepared Egypt to withstand that famine. And so Joseph's family came, the whole household, the whole extended Hebrew people, and lived in Egypt with Joseph. And then Joseph later died, and they say about 400 years later, a new Pharaoh came who did not know Joseph. And that's when the Hebrew people were enslaved. And for don't know how many generations that was the part of the story, until, of course, along came Moses, and Moses is called by God to speak to Pharaoh to set the Hebrew people free. And where we pick up the story today in the book of Exodus, chapter 14, it is after Moses has been going back and forth with Pharaoh, and finally Pharaoh has agreed, yes, take the Hebrew people and take them out of Egypt. And that's the part we pick up with today. When Egypt's king was told that the people had run away, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about the people. They said, "What have we done letting Israel go free from their slavery to us?" So he sent for his chariot and took his army with him. He took 600 elite chariots and all of Egypt's other chariots with captains on all of them. As Pharaoh drew closer, the Israelites looked back and saw the Egyptians marching toward them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Eternal. They said to Moses, "Weren't there enough graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in this desert? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt like this? Didn't we tell you the same thing in Egypt? Leave us alone. Let us work for the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to work for the Egyptians than to die in the desert." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand your ground and watch the Eternal rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never, ever see again. The Lord will fight for you. You just keep still." Then Moses stretched his hand out over the sea. The Eternal pushed the sea back by a strong east wind all night, turning the sea into dry land. The waters were split into two, and the Israelites walked into the sea on dry ground. The waters formed a wall for them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians chased them and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and cavalry. As morning approached, the Eternal looked down on the Egyptian camp from the column of lightning and cloud and threw the Egyptian camp into a panic. The Eternal jammed their chariot wheels so that they wouldn't turn easily. The Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites because the Eternal is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Eternal said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water comes back and covers the Egyptians, their chariots, and their cavalry." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. At daybreak, the sea returned to its normal depth. The Egyptians were driving toward it, and the Eternal tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the cavalry, Pharaoh's entire army that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. The Israelites, however, walked on dry ground through the sea. The waters formed a wall for them on their right hand and on their left. Once again, we have difficult stories that have been passed off as children's stories. And yet they are stories that are very frightening, or they can be. One of the things that I had the opportunity to talk with somebody about was how there's this perceived idea that the stories of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible are all stories about an angry God. And that the New Testament, the stories from the time of Jesus and onward, are stories about a loving God. And I believe that's a false dichotomy, something that Christians in anti-Semitic understanding drew out from these texts. For Jesus, the Hebrew Bible was good news. It was the stories of God in covenant with the people, God blessing people and bringing them out and teaching them ways of being in community. And you all know that I take scripture very seriously, but not literally. And so I believe that these stories were people's way of trying to understand their relationship to the eternal, to the divine, to God. And so these stories capture those moments, those stories that stood out for the people that they passed on, saying, this was God who did this. But really, it was our understanding of God, right? Our interpretation. And that the gifts that Jesus drew out for those of us who are Christian were these gifts of God teaching about love for others, loving neighbor as self, loving God with your whole being. That there is only one eternal God. And that the people fought with one another. And that broke community. And therefore, challenges arised over and over. And we talked about that on Sunday with how Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery led to this 400 years later, the entire people being in slavery. That broken community adds to broken community. And that we need to break that system, right? And today we've got these texts of having to walk through danger, walk through challenge, go through the waters to get to the next point. Of course, the people are saying, Moses, why did you lead us out into this? It would have been better if we had just died in Egypt. Let us go back to what we knew. Let us go back to what was familiar. And yet God was calling the people forward, and so they had to walk through. And there was fear and there was horror in that time in the Egyptians' death. And so where do we find the good news in that? Where do we find the moving forward in those challenges? This coming Sunday, we're going to be talking about the visioning process we've been doing for this last year, 2 years, and where I believe I have heard all of you saying, this is where we are and this is where we're called. So I believe that's going to be a discussion of walking through the dry land, I pray. Walking through with fear, being led into what we know is going to be wilderness and yet is truly God's call for us in this time as we continue to walk through these latter days of pandemic and into a new season this fall, caring about climate change, working on it more particularly. Anyway, I'll say more about that on Sunday and invite us all into conversation. So I hope you're able to join us on Sunday at 10 o'clock, either in the bigger balcony or in person. If you're in the bigger balcony and get to use the Zoom option, I highly encourage that for the interaction pieces of Sunday's worship. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. So God's blessings to you as you ponder this whole story of walking through hardships, possibly into wilderness, but still seeking to follow God. Blessings, everyone.